Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this next session in Global Health Core's Shift Happens series. Today, we have a wonderful fireside chat with Laurie Edelman and Mina Metatiri on the intersection of race, gender, and health. I'm Hannah Taylor. I'm GHC's Director of Community Impact. And in a week that started with celebrating International Women's Day, where we're in March as Women's History Month, we're following February as Black History Month. I am so delighted to have our exceptional speakers, Laurie and Mina, who are going to be bringing a wealth of professional experience and personal activism to this dialogue. And I thank each of you who is joining us today for this really imperative conversation at such an important time in our world's history. So I'm actually not going to take very long to introduce this session because I really want the maximum time for you to hear from our speakers, but I could not be more grateful and humbled to have Mina and Laurie joining us for this Shift Happens. It's my honor to have the opportunity to introduce our moderator, Mina Metatiri. So Mina is a fellow, indeed, all the applause. Mina is a fellow alumna of Global Health Core's community, and she is an exceptional leader and public health advocate in the global health space. She is an epidemiologist by training, and she currently works as the Deputy Director for the Cancer Registries Program at Vital Strategy, where she spearheads many of their global initiatives. She's been working with ministries of health throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America to improve their health systems and data usage in the development of their health policies. And as we all know, everything from how data is captured and analyzed and presented to how policies are written and then ultimately become practice impacts how equity is actually realized in systems, including health systems. So she is bringing that wealth of perspective and experience to what it means to develop and sustain these equitable systems throughout our world. She is a passionate advocate for health equity, including these spaces of racial and gender equity, which we'll be talking about today. So it's going to be a great discussion. I really want to thank you again, Mina and Laurie, for joining us. And I think the only thing I'm sad about today is that we just have an hour with you, because that will barely scratch the surface of the amazing insights, comments, and such that you can share. So I hope everyone on the line will also share insights, comments, questions into the chat and the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as possible during our time today. So with that, and with great excitement, I will pass it over to Mina.
Thank you, Hannah. So as Hannah mentioned, my name is Mina Metatiri, and I am pleased to introduce our speaker today for this fireside chat on the intersection of race, gender, and health, Laurie Edelman. But before I start, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I am sitting on traditional land of the coastal Salish people, including the Duwamish people past and present. I honor with gratitude the land itself and the contributions of the Duwamish tribe. So let's get started. Before I introduce Laurie, I want to get a sense of how people are feeling. So please check off one or two words in the poll that best describes how you are feeling today. I know for some folks it's like late in the afternoon, early evening. For me, it's still morning. Yeah. And the poll answers reflect that. Exhausted came in with the highest response. Next with grateful. I definitely hear you on that in terms of how you're feeling. And a few said challenged, engaged. One person said discouraged. Another said rested. For those who are discouraged, I hope by the end of this conversation today that you feel more encouraged and need a moment to rest. How else are you feeling today? Optimistic. So that is great. I just want to share something on the screen really quick. So I asked this question because I think it's very important to check in with ourselves. And there are these four quadrants in which our feelings are often can often be placed. So those of us who are feeling optimistic, challenged in a good way, engaged, we're in the thriving zone. Those of us who feel impatient, frustrated, anxious, we're more in the surviving zone. And those of us who feel exhausted, which it seems like a lot of us are, we are in the burnout zone. And lastly, those of us who are feeling very grateful, rested, receptive, we're in the recovery zone. All of these zones are equally important. Burnout tells us we need to take time to jump into recovery. Thriving allows us to be our best selves and push ourselves. Surviving, hopefully we do this in spurts and not all the time. But these are just things that I just wanted to raise for us to think about as we enter this conversation. Because for many of us, we wear multiple hats and multiple identities, and that may result in us feeling at various moments in our lives in each of these quadrants at various times. So thank you for the poll participation. And we will get started. So for me, this topic is particularly important discussion to have as we look at defining the kind of society that we want to live in this post-pandemic era. A few days ago, we celebrated International Women's Day, and we celebrated so many wonderful women, change agents and pioneers, both past and present. Every year, though, one thing that always comes to mind for me is that the struggle for equity and justice is not the same for all women, in particular women of color, especially Black women in the United States. Black women in the U.S. are paid 30% less than white men and 21% less than white women. Black women are also more than twice as likely as white women to work in the lowest paying service sector jobs. 63% of Black mothers are primary breadwinners in their families, compared to only 36.8% of white mothers. When it comes to health outcomes, Black women are more likely to die from heart disease and breast cancer than any other group of women or men in the United States. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during childbirth or suffer from pregnancy-related complications than white women. And when it comes to chronic stress, Black women experience weathering. And this is a phenomenon where the bodies age faster than white women due to stressors linked to social determinants of health. So on the outside, Black may not crack, but on the inside, we're kind of suffering. For many Black women, we are essential contributors to the productivity, wealth, and success of this nation. But for many years, Black men have supported their families and served as leaders in their communities and society at large, yet our contributions to the U.S. society and economy have been undervalued and undercompensated. So Black women have voted at comparatively higher rates than all other groups of men and women in the last 2 presidential elections. However, we remain underrepresented at every level of federal and state political office in the United States. These are not new facts or statistics. Many of these facts I learned 10 years ago when I was in graduate school, learning about social determinants of health as I was training to become an epidemiologist. So what has changed in the last decade? Not much. However, COVID has allowed us to see all of these inequities and lay them bare in terms of what is fragmenting our society and brought them to the forefront of our attention. The pandemic has also created opportunities to have necessary conversations like the one we are going to have today. So we are going to discuss intersectionality based on race, gender, and health. And we're also going to talk about topics around the lack of equity in leadership, specifically around gender and race equity in leadership in the health sector. And we're also going to touch a bit on decolonizing the global health sector and the potential for progress. So with that, I'm going to introduce Lori Edelman. Lori is an advocate and media maker who passionately promotes reproductive, racial, and gender justice globally. She currently serves as the Vice President of Influence and Engagement at Global Fund for Women, where she's working to leverage influence and visibility to support gender justice movements globally. She has authored and supported the expression of essential topics on race and gender through her work running Feministing, and her features in publications such as Rookie Magazine, Elle.com, and the New York Times. She was named to the Roots 100 list of the nation's most influential African Americans and to both Forbes and Brooklyn Magazine's list of the 30 under 30. We cannot wait to hear from her today and share her insights and reflections on how we can make the shift happen at this intersection of race, gender, and health. So thank you so much for joining us today, Lori.
Thank you so much, Mina. You are such a force. I'm so grateful to be in your company, and thank you to GHC for bringing us together. I already told Mina I'm so intrigued and excited by your work, and I can't wait to learn more. And you've really laid out the picture already. Those data points, I can tell you're a data person. Those data points are so powerful. They say it all. It's right there. You cannot argue with that. Before I kind of get started, I want to piggyback off of Mina and throw another poll up just so we can get the participation going with this amazing group. So I want to learn a little bit more about you and your relationship to the topic today. So we're going to launch another poll question. This question is, where does this conversation that we're having today, this conversation around the intersection of race, gender, and health, where does this fall for you? Is this comfort zone? Is this learning edge? Or is this danger zone for you? So please pick one of the three. Hosts and panelists cannot vote. I've been disenfranchised. Very, very typical in America to disenfranchise the Black woman, but that's okay. So we're just gonna rely on you all to participate. We want 100% participation if possible, and we're gonna get that information up. Comfort zone, learning edge, danger zone. And Mina, while they are answering that poll question, do you want me to kind of just jump in? How would you like me to start?
Yeah, I think it would be wonderful to hear more about your personal journey, where you find purpose in this work, and and just to see where does the intersection of race, gender, and health fall for you, and what does that mean to you?
Great. Well, thank you so much. And wow. Okay, some of these poll results are coming in. So we have a lot of learners. I'm also going to put myself in the learning camp. So I'm with you in that area. And that's really great to hear. And it's amazing we have folks who are in their comfort zone. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Nobody's in the danger zone. That's super interesting. Well, just a little bit about my journey. I have definitely pretty much my whole life identified as an activist. But what I would say is that I very much felt that there was a choice to be made. What kind of activist was I going to be? And I would say pretty much by the time I was in high school, there was almost kind of these two distinct categories of, okay, are you a racial justice activist or are you a feminist activist? And I did not personally know about or see a lot of pathways to be both. And part of that is ignorance. Part of that is education. We don't learn about the amazing Black feminist freedom fighters both in the US and globally when we're coming up. So I did not have that to look to. Of course, now I'm constantly, looking for those Pan-African voices, and I'm, deferring to, I'm reading and listening to Miss Angela Davis and learning from her internationalism and all of these things. But growing up, it felt almost like an identity crisis to have to choose and say, well, either I'm down for my people and I'm in this racial justice fight, or I'm in this feminist fight, which is kind of dominated by white women in a lot of ways. And so I kind of was struggling with that. And actually in college, I was really involved with a lot of racial justice initiatives, and it was some of the sexism that I experienced that, kind of made me reevaluate some of these choices that I thought, the false choices that I thought I had in front of me. I remember, just for example, this is a really micro example, but there were some elections for the Black Students Association leadership board. And I remember one of my fellow students, a man, told me, well, if you're going to run for office, you really shouldn't be seen out at parties, doing anything, drinking, flirting, none of that, because you have to be seen as a pillar of the community. And so it was just, these are just some subtle things, very small microaggressions, but the respectability politics there made me kind of say, well, it can't just be one or the other. We really need to be able to look at this holistically. And how that has grown for me is really about my feminism being capacious. And I take that directly from Angela Davis. And what that means to me is that it's not gender first. Feminism does not mean we only have to look at gender first. And my career in feminism does not mean that I have to choose between my identity as a Black woman and my identity as a woman or a Black person. So that was really important to me and revelatory for me. And then it grows from there. So what I always say, I think pretty much every person of color, every person from the global South, every person from a historically marginalized community who works in international development, they've had to make their own way in a lot of ways. This is not an easy field to break into. This field can be very elite. I didn't have a passport until I went to college. I did not leave the country. I grew up with a single mom. We were not globetrotters, and so I really didn't know about this wide world that was out there. And I feel like many of the people of color, many of the decolonizing forces in our sector today, we have all felt like we had to make our own way in a lot of different ways. And what's been really exciting is to see people find each other and come together and be able to really have an impact on this sector. And so I'm excited to see that all building and happy to kind of dig into that a little bit more with you all today.
Thanks, Lori. Just listening to you speak, it kind of made me ask myself, where and when did I start my social justice journey? And did it start as social justice for gender, or did it start as social justice for race? And I think because I wear my ethnicity front and center. So I'm Nigerian, and I'm American by citizenship. So technically Nigerian American, but I'm an immigrant. And so I know for me growing up, I grew up in the Midwest, the heart of America, and I was always the one and the only in my class. And I think my first kind of inklings around injustice was around race. So a lot of my growing up in early childhood, high school years was really about racial equity, speaking my truth to power, and taking up as much space as possible, especially when it came to sentiments around Africa and Africans. So I think a lot of these things that I heard growing up when it came to being an African or being Black were just things that, unfortunately, I was getting from both sides, both whites and Blacks. And as I've grown up, I've had to really kind of to reconcile that. And you're right, you can't just say it's one or the other. It's kind of like all working together. And so I know for many people, they wear those hats in different ways as well. So when it comes to the pandemic, how do you think that has kind of changed the landscape or the narrative around some of these intersections?
Thank you so much for that question. And I believe the GHC Community Impact Team has also dropped this question into the chat. So if you can also drop your response into the chat box as to how the last year and the COVID-19 pandemic has shaped your thoughts on these issues, we'd love to read them. I think from my perspective, you just described intersectionality so well. And that's so important to see, because I have to say, I have to speak out on this. Maybe you've seen this too, Mina, but the word intersectionality has just been almost ruined for me because people just use it all types of ways. It's kind of like the word diverse. Like we've started these words. We need to check ourselves on how we're using these words. And I see even the word diverse, like we're seeking a diverse candidate. That phrase, right? That phrase implies the word diverse in that sentence is relational. So it implies that you have to be diverse from something. And so the assumption is that there's a white center and we're looking for diversity from that. And so the whole thing reinforces why we need diversity in the first place. And it's sort of like a trip for me. But really what I see with COVID-19, and you mentioned Global Fund for Women in the introduction, but Global Fund for Women works in 6 regions around the world. And so we've really been looking at how are our partners impacted by this. And what we're seeing with regards to the regions and how they're faring, and this is always changing, is actually the Americas and Europe have some of the worst outbreaks among regions, with the US, as we all know, having among the most cases in the world, a really, really dire situation. The Americas, both North and South Americas, have had about 38 million confirmed cases, followed by Europe with 28 million cases. And I think these numbers are even going up, then Asia, then the Middle East, then Africa. And we do see emerging specific hotspots, notably Brazil, South Africa, Colombia, Chile. But overall, populations who experienced a novel virus before were a little bit more prepared. So if you've dealt with SARS, if you've dealt with MERS, if you've dealt with Ebola, you had some of this infrastructure. And so what we see, which I think is so important for our sector to be lifting up, is that many middle and low income countries are way outperforming, certainly the US and many other countries on the pandemic. And we're seeing that with collaborations between health and other sectors, healthcare workers effectively advocating for support, better mobilization of private sector resources, and what I mentioned, leveraging existing systems. That to say, I don't want to paint an overly glossy picture, but certainly if there's not a moment to pause and step back and observe some of the assumptions that we have around the direction that learning needs to be happening, I think now is one of those times. Certainly we've seen deep inequities, and there's 2 areas where I think it's a travesty that our sector is not shouting from the rooftops when it comes to COVID-19. So 1 is vaccines and 2 is prisoners. These are just 2 areas where our sector, for all the talk about decolonization, for all the talk about intersectionality, where is the advocacy? Where is the voice? And I'm a communicator, Mina. So if we're not lifting it up and talking about it and putting it in people's faces, and I don't see the action there, and I'm really looking for that. So on vaccines, look, I'm working in front of a computer. Withhold my vaccine. Someone with a medical condition in a lower and middle income country should get it first. Why should my American status lend me better access? Rich countries are hoarding the world's vaccines. Why don't we say that? We need to use that word. We need to say that there is no reason that where you're born or where you live should determine whether you live or die because of this vaccine. And we know because of this virus, and we know that that is the case. But sometimes we just need to say these things plain. And then the second thing is prisoners. Global Fund for Women early on in the pandemic did a big campaign around Let the Prisoners Out. And this was really targeted at some human rights defenders who were behind bars because their government had, done roundups. We saw this with journalists. We saw this with women human rights defenders, notably in Egypt. But generally, let the prisoners out. This is a moment where our abolitionism needs to come into play. And so for me, there's kind of two conversations that need to be connected. So one is around representation in our sector, and one is around systems and structures and our actual politics, and what are we fighting for and who are we fighting for. And so I really think we need to bring those two conversations together. And COVID is just another example of how we're kind of almost there, and sometimes we're getting there, and we can sometimes talk the talk, but I really need us to do more and do better.
Wow, you said a lot. I'm trying to figure out where to jump in, because there's so many things you said. Right off the bat around the word diversity. I have similar words that I just feel like are overused and conflate the actual thing of the thing. So one of them is around the word POC. It's now a catch-all phrase everyone loves to use, POC. I'm like, actually, no, I'm talking about Black people. No, specifically Black people, not POC. So that's one that I found to be a bit problematic. Another thing you started off with when you said equity. The one thing I've noticed is when we talk about equity, diversity in the workspace in particular, if you look back 5 or 6 years ago when we were looking at diversity on boards, it literally landed on women. As long as you have women, then you're diverse. But when you look at the landscape, there's a social media account that I follow called Leadership So White on Instagram. And what this account does is that it goes to the websites of these major organizations, pulls out pictures or hunts down pictures of their board members, and then places them on social media so you can see. There are organizations that have these public-facing mandates about diversity, equity, inclusion. When you look at their boards, when you look at the people actually making the decisions for these organizations, they tend to be white men, white women, making decisions on behalf of Black people, brown folks, or Latinx folks. So I've always found that to be problematic, because when you bring that back to feminism, and people say I'm a feminist, like, okay, but which feminism are you talking about? White feminism ascribes to a certain thing, and it's really self-serving, it's self-centered in many ways, whereas the other feminism brings into account some of those social justice pioneers such as Shirley Chisholm, even Harriet Tubman. It brings to the forefront more Black people that have often been left from the dialogue around gender equity in the United States. So it's almost as if when you talk about feminism here in the country, you're really talking about two different things. Last summer, there was an incident with a woman named Amy Cooper who weaponized a Black man's race in Central Park. Now, Amy Cooper sat on a board at her company, and she would have fit the very definition of diversity. She's a woman, she's high ranking, she's in a position of power, diversity checkbox filled. But when we dig deeper and stop kind of overusing these terms, we see that when we talk about gender equity, race, and inclusion, that we're really leaving out quite a large group of people. So I did want to make that note. The other thing you brought up was around passport politics. As a dual citizen myself, I have to be honest in that my U.S. passport definitely affords me certain kinds of benefits that are just shocking to me just because it's a U.S. passport versus when I use my Nigerian one. And we're seeing that play out now with vaccines. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the United States chose not to sign on to that international agreement, which would make vaccines a lot more accessible for COVID vaccination. So what are your thoughts on that? Because on one hand, the United States promotes, we're all loving equity, justice, give us your huddled masses. And this is kind of the narrative that a lot of international people see about America, land of milk and honey. Yet in the global space, not so much, not as inclusive.
100%. And thank you so much for sharing that, Mina. And I completely agree. And one of the things I hear you really pointing to that's really important is how representation really isn't enough. And so I want to get back to the vaccine question, but just because you raised the question of boards and decision making, I wanted to talk a little bit about representation and structure. And, I get a lot of questions these days around, well, what are the solutions? What should we do to not be problematic, to not be racist, to be more intersectional, to be more diverse? I mean, these questions are on people's minds. And I think notably, a lot of people like to say, well, Black Lives Matter happened and now we need to decolonize. First of all, there have been people making these critiques. Women of color in the global South have been making these critiques of the development sector since it was created. And so really fundamentally, there's no reason why the institutions that make up the development sector have the decision-making power in the first place, besides colonialism. And there's this original sin that's driving the sector that I think we always need to raise. There's amazing people doing this work, Deegan Ali, Edgar Villanueva, a lot of people who have been talking about this doing this work for a long time. And so I think it's really important when we talk about the sector to say, okay, on the one hand, we need more people of color on boards, great. But if the structure of that organization is still such that they are doing things like giving grants that are relatively small with a ton of strings attached, bringing in, HQ or US-based consultants to tell, the local leaders what they need to be doing, putting too many demands or dictating the agenda for local groups who want to decide their own solutions to these issues, disregarding cultural or political considerations, or depoliticizing their work and aid work in general. These are sort of the structural sins that I see us doing. And to be totally honest, I love my people, but one or two or three or four or five Black people at an organization, and I've learned this the hard way, cannot put a stop fundamentally to those issues. And so, one of the things it's really funny to me that I ended up at a fund, and I ended up essentially on the philanthropy side because, I very much did not grow up, like I said, I grew up working class. I wasn't in a philanthropic mindset. I was very much on a hustler mindset. And I really wasn't as familiar with what it meant to, be surrounded by wealth or be making decisions about other people's money. So that whole world is new to me. The world of philanthropy is new to me. But what I've come to appreciate is that so many of the structural issues in our sector come down to funding and donors and resource partners and their understanding of their role. And it's everything from thinking about, okay, we need to promote policies that end capital flight, and we need to think about corruption and tax havens. So there's that side, but there's also what we at Global Fund for Women call a feminist funding model, which is about providing core, unrestricted funding. So that's not us saying, here's money and now you have to spend it this way, but saying, here's money that you can use and be adaptable. So when a global pandemic comes around, you can pivot. And so instead of needing to come to us and say, well, now we need to increase online organizing because we can't be meeting up in real life, you can just do it. Or instead of, saying, well, we're seeing a very alarming uptick in gender-based violence, and we want to create a hotline to address that and get information out about resources that exist. They can just do it without needing to involve us, because we have nothing to add there. Knowing your role as a funder and doing that in a trust-based way. So that's very much the role that Global Fund for Women is aiming to play as a funder. And we've built out a lot of principles, guiding principles, and an orientation around that we're hoping the whole entire Women's Fund community can help make more popular among other kinds of institutions that are playing a funding role within the development sector. And so finally, to kind of answer your question around vaccines and the US, I think we need to call it what it is. It's vaccine hoarding. It's vaccine hoarding, and there should be a norm. Let's say you're completely self-interested, that's fine. You still need to understand how, if only certain countries are getting the vaccine, this pandemic is going to continue. You still need to understand that it's in your own self-interest for these vaccines to be widely available. But even if, that's my most cynical argument, but on a more basic level, there's no reason why the eligibility should change or stop at the border. The people who need the vaccine most should have access to it first. And it is very disappointing. And, I think when it comes to foreign policy and, US decision making, we need to build a movement in this country from the ground up pertaining to foreign policy. Foreign policy is shaped by a narrow elite of policymakers, and it's a huge problem. People in this country, and I've seen this firsthand because I'm part of a lot of different kinds of social justice spaces, and you get blank stares when I say things like global gag rule. And if somebody is not working in this sector, they have not heard of it. They have not heard of it. They do not know the impact of it. They might be pro-choice, they might be pro-abortion rights, they might call themselves a feminist, but they don't have that global consciousness, or they're not engaged with foreign policy, and they're not following along on these things. I know there's polling that shows that people vastly overestimate the percentage of the US budget that's going to aid in foreign countries around the world. And at the same time, they say we should be paying much less, but the much less that they're saying we're paying is against their idea of what we're paying. So what they are suggesting we should be paying is actually eons more than what we're putting into foreign assistance every year. So, that is alarming. There should be a movement around that's grassroots in the US that is linked to a sense of international solidarity. And I think it's really frustrating to me that that we don't have that, and that we're struggling. Even there were glimpses in the Black Lives Matter movement of, connecting the dots between MSARS in Nigeria and, the BLM protests in the US. And, there are so many opportunities for solidarity. Right now, Senegal is rounding up activists and jailing them and beating them. And, Black people in the US need to be speaking up about that. And I don't think it's enough to say, and I'm saying this as a Black American, where I feel that I occupy both areas of privilege and areas of oppression. It's not enough to just say, well, let's fill the organizations with Black people like me. It's important, but there also needs to be that consciousness, that solidarity. And that's what I wrote about in my Guardian piece, and where I think we're still maybe struggling to sit with the contradictions and the nuances there a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the last piece that you make around, all the other injustices that are going on right now that are impacting Black people, and you don't see the same type of fervor as you saw for BLM happening for, across the pond. That kind of speaks to what I was saying earlier about that duality between being Black, but then also being African and Black. There is a hierarchy there. And it's unfortunate because our oppression is tied, right? Our oppression is tied, our suffering is tied, yet there's this split where what happens in Nigeria, what happens in Senegal, that has really nothing to do with me. And I think on the flip side, in countries in Africa where, race isn't really a thing, it doesn't play out in the same way, it might be harder to understand what's going on in the United States. I've seen both of those arguments. But I think it's important to note that, that old adage from MLK, injustice anywhere is now I'm messing it up. Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, something like that. But you get what I'm saying, right? So that it is important to kind of raise these issues, regardless of borders, and that, you know, what impacts one group is similar, impacts another group in another place. There's a question in the chat from one of our participants or attendees today, and he says, I've heard this push within philanthropy to reform funding so it is flexible, long-term, core, et cetera. What is the narrative donors use who choose to continue with the status quo, short-term, restricted, limitations, et cetera? And what will it take to shift their thinking so more donors fund the sector in equitable, trust-based ways? Yeah, that's a good question. So before you start, I just want to say, like, one thing that I do find kind of interesting when it comes to funding, especially international funds, like to African countries, for instance, I've noticed that when funds are going to African nations versus Asian or Latin nations, there's always this, like, how do we know they're going to use the money? We need to put out these oversights. But I don't see that same kind of, like, concern when it comes to non-African countries. So what do you think about that? And also the question in the chat in terms of what do you think it'll take to shift thinking in terms of donors and their sector around equitable trust-based ways?
Yeah, these are great questions, and because we're doing sayings here, I'm gonna botch this saying, but you know, there's a saying, basically, you got to get your own house in order before you go out and tell somebody else about their house, and I think that's really true. So we need to talk laterally. We need to talk laterally. There's a lot, most organizations, if you're based in the global north, you are very focused on, you know, your operations. And I think it's really important that we talk at the sector level, because there's real advocacy that needs to happen there. We need to be in power, in partnership, that is trust-based. We need trust-based philanthropy. We need to be in partnership that necessitates trust on both sides. And you know, Global Fund for Women, actually last year in March, when COVID-19 was first reaching the States, there was a philanthropist pledge, and we joined this, and hundreds of other philanthropists joined this. And it was a pledge of action to, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, loosen funding restrictions, engage in collective learning with grantees, and engage more diverse leaders to better meet the needs of women and girls. And I think that moment was extremely telling, and you can really see directly who kind of stepped up with their funding and loosened these restrictions and supported grantee partners to really be adaptive, and who actually stepped back or, you know, claimed that they just couldn't tap into that endowment. I mean, if not now, when? Why, you know, we're sitting on these billion-dollar endowments, and you have these DAFs and you have these trust funds, and if this is not the emergency, you know, I truly don't know when it is, because people are dying, and people have lost their jobs, they've lost their family members, they've lost so much. And it's terrifying and it's scary. And if you can help, now is the time. And so I really do think it's those lateral conversations. Global Fund for Women has a program called the Champions Program, where we engage individual donors on a learning journey. And I think it's important that we have to do that, because grantee partners should not have to do that. People doing the work, you know, they should not have to be convincing donors or be in that position of convincing donors, because frankly, you know, donors are more likely to listen to fellow donors, and they're more primed to have those conversations about what's working. So you can make the case from a data and evidence perspective, like funding in a trust-based manner works better, and here are the numbers. You can make it from the moral perspective. You can make it from there's a lot of different ways you can make that case, but I think it's important that we are having those community conversations, and that we're not putting the onus on grantee partners to prove that they're trustworthy, because that's where we've already lost. And I'm happy to share more information about the Champions program and the curriculum that we've developed, because it's really been powerful to kind of shift people's understanding of their role as donors and what they can achieve with their money. And you see that there's a lot of fear that people have around, well, what if I'm wasting my money, or what if my money doesn't go to what I think it's meant to be going to? And you can really open up the conversation by just sharing that actually it's that exact fear and the needing to be in control that actually undermines the process of philanthropy and the process of development. And so ironic, but walking people through that journey, I think, has been really rewarding, and it's a really important part of shifting the power in these conversations.
Thank you. So you talked about the role of donors in philanthropy. So let's talk about the roles of leadership in general in the health sector. Where are the gaps in leadership in health globally as you see it, as it relates to the intersection of race and gender?
These are great questions. I mean, I think I discussed aid is political. So I think we really need leaders with political conscience who have read and understand. They understand that underdeveloped countries aren't that way by happenstance. They understand that, this is all part of a design. They understand that we're in, and, the very current effects of colonialism and empire and violence. And they're willing to give up power, give up privilege to address that. And so I've said it, but I just want to keep repeating, representation is important, but that can't be the whole politics that we embody if we're really going to transform this sector. So that's just a conversation that I think nonprofits especially really need to have, because I think there's this sense of, well, if you are technically, if you have the experience and you're, not necessarily a technocrat, but you built up your program management skills, and you've lived in country, and you have this resume and you have these references, then you're fit to lead. Well, guess what? I think we need to be having a serious question around, what are your politics? What have you done to support the communities and to build trust with the communities that you're claiming to and aiming to serve with this organization or nonprofit? What do they have to say about you? And even better, if you're of and from that community.
Thank you. You've said this key word twice now, power. Frederick Douglass said it best: power concedes nothing unless demanded, right? So let's move into decolonization. You've shared openly about your own experience in the global development sector, arriving in Kenya for a work trip and being surprised at how you were treated, and that the difference you were shown as an American led you to think about the norms and global work around gender, race, and power. What would you say decolonization in the sector means to you?
Long term, I don't believe our sector should exist as it exists today. These money and resources are not ours to be doling out. So I think we should distribute the resources as quickly and efficiently as possible. And I actually did read that Medium article that the DHC Community Impact Team just shared, and I was really impressed by it. I think there's some great ideas there as well. But most importantly, we kind of all need to work ourselves out of a job. And, what's interesting about the Guardian piece, really, I think two things. One, there was a trendy narrative happening at the time of, we all need to be having a racial reckoning, and Black Lives Matter, and it's kind of a trend that we don't want to be behind. And so, everyone was going through this, and they asked me to write about this. And, I think there is an expectation of, especially on Black women, to say, I'm going to bare my soul. I'm going to share this story of victimhood to meet the moment. And then everybody can say, well, we've given this a platform and now we can move on. And I know media. I know how media works because I ran a website for a very long time. And part of writing that piece was about subverting expectations a little bit around what my story is and how it gets to be used in the media. And so, while the editor originally requested a kind of very me-centered piece, it was really important for me to be real about the experiences in the sector, but of Black women, but also talk about some of these structural issues and talk about how it's not only about workplace discrimination, but workplace discrimination is indicative of this much deeper issue around race and around nation states and just transnational politics. And so I think that was why, and it was important for me to talk about being surprised that, when I go to another country, when I go to Kenya, senior level colleagues are being so deferential, and it is that power of the American passport, and to be honest about that, and to again be able to hold both. Yes, workplace discrimination is a huge problem, and I've really come up against horrific white feminism in my career that I've only been able to overcome because I was able to build my own story through my own website by having, my own projects going on where I could build my own leadership. I think it's really important that we can build our own, and we don't rely especially on the white women who are occupying the senior ranks of organizations to lift us up, because they may not ever see it for us that way. So on the one hand, it's important for me to lift that up and affirm the experiences that fellow Black women had experienced across the sector. But on the other hand, I wanted to use that platform that The Guardian was offering me very deliberately to say, and that's not the end of the story. There is also this extreme global North, global South power dynamic that we just somehow are letting persist. And it's a really important part of the racial justice conversation that needs to happen. So I think we still have a long way to go in kind of reconciling that. But the kind of last thing that I wanted to say about this, and I know we're kind of coming up on time, so I hope we can lift up you, Mina, and any others that want to jump in. But the last thing that I just want to say about the Guardian piece is that really what I was shocked to see, as someone who does think a lot about the role of media, is that there's almost this narrative of, well, I think people are still trying to do mental gymnastics to keep the status quo. Even though that story is out there, it's super clear. The data is there, the testimonials are out there. Like every single woman of color I know in this sector has been like, this is true, this is real, this is happening. And there's still the mental gymnastics. So here's two that I hear a lot. One, well, all people of color have diverse experiences, and we can't create a one-size-fits-all approach for them. It's like, well, you can still try. Yes, we're diverse, but there's still things that you can do to make it generally better for people of color. And then the second one that I hear, well, if it's so bad everywhere, then we're not the problem. It's the sector is the problem. And that, I think, is a willful misreading and really points to how deeply invested so many of us are in maintaining the status quo and the fear and the resistance to change. And we are going to have to lose that if our sector is going to be efficient at our stated goals.
I agree. Thank you so much, Laura. I know we're nearly at time. It's been wonderful and really enlightening speaking and hearing from you today. I'm going to hand it over to Hannah, who I think has some additional remarks.
Well, I just want to jump in and thank you, Lori and Mina, so much. Mina, for moderating such an interesting and dynamic conversation. Lori, for your thoughts and insights, for each of you being able to share more, on this topic. And, I was furiously like writing notes and taking my, own insights from everything you were saying. We have covered so many different topics today, from passport politics to representation, to ultimately really thinking about the importance of the dissolution, and dissolving this sector as a whole, so that it really can be about there not being these social determinants of health, and how we're moving in those ways as a sector entirely. So like I said in the beginning, the saddest part about this is that we can only scratch the surface with you two amazing individuals, and what you're sharing and your experience. So want to thank you so much for sharing here. Want to thank everyone who has come and listened into this dialogue. Please do continue to share other thoughts on the community portal, if you're an alum or a fellow, as well as on our social media platforms and in your own circles and communities. But I do want to close us out on, one last question kind of before we really close today. And that's, for the both of you, really thinking about what's the call to action. We've talked about so many different things and so many areas of both need and progress and continued challenge. So when you think about this topic of, the intersection of gender, race, and health, what is, one essential action, and I know there are so many, but that people on the line can think, what can they take to address and reduce these disparities in this area of race, gender, and health in their communities and globally? So I'll pass it to both of you, but why don't I start with Mina?
One word comes to mind, and that's humility. I always cringe when people say, "Oh, Mina, an expert." And I'm like, I'm not an expert. I'm a specialist, because there's still room there when you call yourself a specialist to recognize that you still have a lot to learn. I will never be an expert in anything. I will always be somebody who's continuously learning. So I think having a humble mindset in this work, and I'm going to quote a sentence that Lori wrote in her article, in the Guardian article, that really resonated with me. And that quote is, "Feminism is homework." And she goes on to say, she's quoting someone else, Sarah Ahmed, but she goes on to say, "Homework isn't glorified. It's done quietly, behind the scenes, learning that may bear fruit down the line when knowledge is truly tested. Gender and development practitioners must similarly embrace such a student mindset." And I 100% agree with that. I think when the student is ready, the master appears. And I think we need to start being more intentional about being students of life and doing away with all of these labels about expert and I work here, I'm this and I'm that. I don't care. I need you to humble yourself and really take stock of where you are in this whole spectrum, and also to see where your power lies. I think we all have power. I don't empower anyone. The work I do doesn't empower anybody. What I'm trying to do is step aside or push avenues with the power I have to make space for people to show up and to use the power that they have that they may not have had an opportunity to show before. That's what people have done for me, and I want to do that for them. Global Health Corps has been the moving of this space so I can show up with my own power. Global Health Corps didn't empower me. I already had it. What you did was open up channels and avenues. And I think if we can take more of a mindset around that in development work and really taking stock, it then calls people in, both men and women, to address these gender issues, these racial issues, and the intersections in which we all stand in. So that's my takeaway and my 2 cents. So thank you so much, Hannah and Lori. I really, really appreciated talking to you today.
Woo! Wow. Yes, yes, Mina. I absolutely +1 everything. I think that really should be the last word. Mina, you said it, and I love how Sarah Ahmed, first of all, pedagogy, feminist pedagogy as complaint, like She has an entire framework that is not specific to our sector about this work and what happens when you speak up and how that starts an entire chain reaction. And so absolutely appreciate and value what you just shared. And I will just keep it short. And my call to action: flexibly fund grassroots gender justice and racial justice leaders for lasting change. Trust them, support them. Totally agree with Mina. You do not have the ability to empower them, but make space for their power.
Thank you so much, Lori and Mina. Such wonderful words to end on. And I just can't thank you enough for this incredible and dynamic conversation. Please keep it going. If one thing you took away from this, I hope it was that this is not a one-off place, but a conversation that needs and should continue and should recenter from any place of whiteness or patriarchy and really be this holistic space. So that is definitely what I am taking away as one area, and such gratitude to Lori and Mina for being here, as well as everyone who has joined us today. So thank you for sharing your insights and time with our community. Thank you, everyone who has been on the line. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please, everyone, stay healthy.